In the gaslit corridors of the Victorian era, spanning the long reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, a distinct tension hung in the air, an invisible current woven from the threads of stringent social norms, moral rectitude, and the suffocating corsets of societal expectation. Every whisper of silk against polished floors, every measured step upon cobblestones, carried the weight of rules unspoken, yet deeply enforced. Welcome, then, to the theatre of Victorian courtship, a stage where affection was carefully orchestrated, where the faintest brush of a sleeve could scandalize, and where the gaze of a stranger might ignite whispers that would outlive the moment itself. In this world, chaperones loomed like ever-watchful sentinels, their presence designed to suffocate spontaneity. Men and women, bound by etiquette, existed in parallel orbits, rarely touching, yet constantly aware of the gravitational pull between them. Imagine the silent agony of exchanging stolen glances, the desperate yearning hidden beneath polite bows and guarded smiles, only to know that the chains of propriety forbade even the briefest graze of fingers. For those who lived within this tightly bound ritual, love was less a matter of hearts and more a negotiation of appearances, contracts, and legacies. Step, if you dare, into the parlour of a grand London townhouse, perhaps one resembling that of Charles Dickens himself, the chronicler of the age, who laid bare its hypocrisies and cruelties. Picture the heavy draperies shutting out the dirty fog of the city, the gilded mirrors reflecting polished manners but concealing raw truths, the piano in the corner prepared to strike a melody to ease the oppressive silence. In this room, eyes meet across the distance, words are spoken with rehearsed caution, and entire futures hang upon whether a family approves or disapproves. Could you, dear listener, survive the suffocating choreography of such a life? Could you endure a dance in which every movement was scripted, every sigh suppressed, and every desire buried under layers of lace and decorum? But if the courtship was suffocating, then the wedding night, the moment meant to symbolize consummation, intimacy, and unity, became something far darker. In polite society, the subject was shrouded in silence, whispered only behind closed doors, often spoken of as if it were a sacred duty rather than an act of love. Yet hidden beneath those layers of lace, beneath the perfumed sheets of Victorian bedrooms, was a truth far more harrowing than novels or etiquette manuals dared to describe. For women, particularly those of marginalized descent, the wedding night was not always a gentle unveiling of intimacy, but a forced submission cloaked in the sanction of law, religion, and class. This was the era that prided itself on civility, yet treated women's bodies as property to be exchanged, subdued, and controlled. To be married was, in many cases, to be delivered, and for women of colour in particular, those caught in the machinery of empire, colonialism, and racial prejudice, the so-called sanctity of marriage concealed practices that bordered on the inhuman. Tonight, we peel back the velvet curtain and step into the hushed, candle-lit chambers of Victorian England. Beyond the surface of elegance lies a narrative of coercion, violation, and systemic racism so deeply woven into the social fabric that few dared question it. This is not the romance of storybooks, nor the gentle courtship of ballrooms and sonnets. This is a tale of dread, of rituals that turned moments of supposed joy into lifelong horror. So ask yourself, before we begin this descent into the shadows of history, what happens when love is stripped of tenderness, when marriage becomes a contract of control, and when the wedding night itself, meant to bind two souls together, becomes, instead, the site of racialized torment? The answers lie not in the fairy tales told to us, but in the silences of history that we are about to unearth. London in the mid-19th century was a city both magnificent and monstrous. Beneath the gaslit lamps that flickered along the cobblestone streets, wealth paraded itself in gilded carriages, while, not far away, destitute children huddled in alleyways. The city exhaled coal smoke and human ambition, a ceaseless tide of noise, class conflict, and unspoken cruelties. Among its grand parlours and ballrooms, Victorian society constructed its own rigid theatre, one in which class, gender, and race defined every possible role a person might inhabit. For those marked as outsiders, every step was a negotiation of dignity. It was into this world that Amara Josephine, a young woman of Afro-Caribbean descent, found herself thrust. Her father, once an enterprising merchant from the island colonies, had amassed modest wealth by supplying sugar and cotton to Britain's factories. His family's move to London was meant to signal respectability, an attempt to secure a future his children might not otherwise find on colonial soil. But wealth, in the London of that age, did not erase skin, nor did it dismantle prejudice. Every glance in the streets, every whisper in drawing rooms, reminded the Josephines that their place was tolerated, not embraced. Amara, just 17, carried herself with quiet grace. She was educated, her speech softened by tutors who had tried to smooth her colonial inflections. She played piano in the evenings and embroidered by candlelight, all the accomplishments expected of a young lady. Yet behind her composure was an awareness, sharpened daily, that she lived under scrutiny. When she walked in Hyde Park with her mother, parasol in hand, eyes followed. Some curious, some disdainful, others calculating. She was not simply a young woman of marriageable age. She was an emblem of a family trying to climb a ladder that society had already sawn in half. Victorian England offered women few choices, and even fewer for women of colour. Marriage was not only a personal union, but an economic arrangement, a negotiation of alliances that could determine a family's survival. For the Josephines, the unspoken fear was always the same, that without the protection of a husband respected in white society, Amara would forever remain precarious, vulnerable to the prejudices that could, at any moment, undo all they had built. So the family welcomed suitors, not those of Amara's choosing, but those her father deemed strategic. Men whose pale faces, polished manners, and ancestral names could shelter her beneath the illusion of acceptance. It mattered little that these suitors viewed her less as a person and more as a symbol, an exotic adornment, a curiosity, or worse, a possession to be displayed. What mattered was the contract, the binding of names, and the veneer of security. The chosen man was Edward Ashcroft, a barrister from a long line of lawyers. His family was neither the richest nor the most powerful, but they held the kind of respectability that opened doors to Parliament, clubs, and courts. Ashcroft was 10 years Amara's senior, a man whose demeanour was calm, whose words were measured, whose reputation was clean. To the Josephines, this appeared a blessing. A man whose name could soften gossip, whose standing could protect Amara from the harsher cruelties of society. But beneath his polished manners was a colder truth, one invisible to her parents. To Edward, the match was not a union of hearts. It was an acquisition, a merging of wealth and exoticism, a transaction that amused his social circle and satisfied his ambitions. Where others saw Amara's dignity, Edward saw only the thrill of domination, the chance to possess what others exoticized, to claim a body his peers would speak of with curiosity behind closed doors. The engagement unfolded with all the rituals Victorian society demanded. Invitations embossed with gilt lettering circulated among acquaintances, dresses were fitted, gloves ordered, a veil chosen. Amara moved through these preparations like an actress reciting lines in a play written long before her birth. At fittings, her waist was drawn tighter and tighter until breathing itself became a task, as if society sought not only to bind her body, but her very spirit. In parlours, matrons spoke of her good fortune, though their eyes betrayed scepticism. Could such a marriage truly erase the stain of difference? Could a coloured bride truly belong among them? Yet in every silence, in every stiff smile, Amara felt the walls closing in. At night, in her candle-lit room, she sat before the mirror, the ivory comb in her hand pausing mid-stroke through her thick curls. She wondered if marriage would offer her dignity or erase it completely. Was she walking into safety or into a cage lined with silk? The day of the wedding arrived with all its pomp. Carriages lined the church steps, their wheels crunching upon gravel. Guests gathered in silks and starched collars, their whispers rising like smoke beneath the vaulted ceiling. Amara's gown gleamed white, though it felt to her like a shroud. The organ thundered, the vows were spoken, and in the eyes of society, she was now bound, no longer Amara Josephine, but Mrs. Edward Ashcroft. The applause, the clinking of glasses, the music that followed, it all blurred together in her mind. What she could not escape was the knowledge that every ritual had been designed not for her freedom, but for her surrender. Her parents smiled, comforted by the illusion that they had secured her future. The guests drank and dined, satisfied that propriety had been observed. And Edward, her husband, watched her with a gaze that chilled her to the bone, a gaze that suggested the night ahead would not be one of tenderness, but of entitlement. For the Victorian Age was an era that masked cruelty beneath ceremony, where society demanded obedience of women, demanded silence of the marginalized, and sanctioned acts of domination under the holy seal of marriage. And as the carriages departed, as the candles flickered low, as Amara was led into the marital home that now bore her name, the true story, the story of inhuman practice, was only just beginning. The house to which Amara was carried after her. Wedding was not simply a home, it was a monument to the Ashcroft name. The townhouse stood tall among rows of brick and stone, its windows curtained in heavy velvet, its floors lined with imported carpets. Chandeliers glittered above polished dining tables, portraits of pale ancestors stared from the walls, and every corner whispered of inheritance. It was into this space, a place that radiated power and exclusion, that Amara was delivered, dressed, in silk, yet feeling as though her skin itself betrayed her. Servants carried trunks, doors closed behind her, and soon she found herself alone with her husband in the candle-lit silence of the bridal chamber. The room, with its four-poster bed and perfumed draperies, was arranged as a stage for a ritual society deemed sacred. Yet to Amara, it felt like a theatre of dread. For all her life, the subject of the wedding night had been shrouded in silence. No mother's counsel, no books dared speak plainly. What awaited her was both unknown and terrifying, a blank page filled only with foreboding. Edward's demeanour had shifted. The carefully courteous man who had charmed her parents now allowed his true nature to seep through. His gaze was not of tenderness, but of claim, as though he had purchased a possession now delivered into his hands. He spoke little, but his silence was heavy, filled with expectation that needed no words. Amara, standing rigid in her gown, felt the weight of centuries pressing upon her. The history of women turned into property, of bodies defined not by self, but by law. For in Victorian England, a wife was not her own. The legal doctrine of coverture declared that upon marriage, a woman's identity was absorbed by her husband's. She could own nothing, decide nothing, claim nothing for herself, and for women of colour, the burden was doubled. Not only gender, but race marked them as lesser, as subject to the gaze and control of those who believed themselves superior. Amara was not only Edward's wife, she was his proof, his trophy, his embodiment of the exotic conquest his peers would whisper about behind brandy and cigars. The night began with the ritual stripping away of layers, gloves removed, gown loosened, corset untied. Each layer felt less like intimacy and more like the peeling of defences, as though society itself had conspired to render her utterly vulnerable. Edward's hands were not gentle. They were deliberate, assured, as if fulfilling a rite rather than offering affection. Amara's breath quickened, not with anticipation, but with dread. As hours unfolded, she realized the cruel paradox of her situation. Though her family believed she had been secured within respectability, in truth, she had been delivered into a prison. The walls of the Ashcroft house did not protect her. They confined her. Outside, the world would see her as fortunate, married into a family of standing. Inside, she was alone, her voice swallowed by silence, her fears dismissed as hysteria should she dare speak them aloud. In the days that followed, the weight of the marriage grew heavier. Edward's demeanour in public remained polished, his hand at her back, his voice steady. Guests praised their union, remarking on her elegance, her composure, always with the subtle undertone of curiosity about her complexion, her lineage, her difference. At dinner tables, men joked of exotic, blood, and civilizing unions, their laughter echoing like knives hidden in velvet. Edward did not defend her. Instead, he revelled in it, basking in the intrigue her presence afforded him. Behind closed doors, the entitlement deepened. What began as the cold possession of a body turned into a routine of domination, cloaked in the justification of marital right. There was no language of consent in Victorian law, no acknowledgement that a wife could refuse. To be wed was to be bound, to surrender autonomy at the altar. And so Amara endured, each night a repetition of dread, each morning a performance of composure. Her isolation was profound. Letters to her family were read before leaving the house, her movements monitored. In public, she was paraded as a symbol of Edward's liberality, his progressive taste. In private, she was reduced to silence. The house that glittered with chandeliers became a gilded cage, each room echoing with her footsteps, each mirror reflecting a woman she no longer recognized. The racialized cruelty was not confined to Edward alone. The household staff, trained in obedience to their master, mirrored his attitudes. Some looked upon Amara with disdain, others with curiosity, but few with respect. Whispers circulated, derisive, comments about her heritage, insinuations about her worth. Even her servants became part of her surveillance, reporting her movements, interpreting her silences as weakness. The pressure built with each passing week. Amara's spirit, once steady, began to fracture beneath the weight of endless subjugation, yet she clung to fragments of herself. In the quiet moments by the window, watching fog roll across the Thames, in the stolen minutes at the piano, her fingers striking chords that no one else cared to hear. These were her rebellions, small yet vital, the only spaces where she could remember that she was more than a possession. But Edward noticed, and in his mind, rebellion, even in its smallest form, was insolence. The stage was set for escalation, for punishment disguised as discipline, for cruelty excused as marital authority. The whispers of society, the silence of law, and the entitlement of a husband converged upon her like tightening coils. And thus the rising action of her ordeal took shape, each day heavier than the last, each night darker, each breath a negotiation of survival. The climax loomed, a reckoning inevitable, a night when the facade of civility would finally shatter, revealing the full inhumanity lurking beneath the Victorian veil. The night had arrived when silence itself seemed to suffocate. Amara stood, in the Ashcroft home, the gas lamps flickering low, shadows stretching long across the walls like grasping hands. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender water and polished oak, yet beneath it lurked something sour, something that made her chest tighten. The house was hushed, servants dismissed, doors locked. Only the sound of the clock in the hall marked the passage of time, each tick dragging her closer to inevitability. Edward entered the chamber with the calm precision of a man performing a ritual. His boots struck the floor in steady rhythm, his jacket removed, his waistcoat unbuttoned with deliberate slowness. The civility he had displayed at dinner, the polite smile offered to guests, had already drained from his features. What remained was something colder, entitlement sharpened into cruelty. Amara felt her body tense, the fine lace of her nightgown, a fragile barrier against the weight of his gaze. She stood still, as if stillness itself might shield her. But Edward moved closer, circling her as one might circle prey. His hand brushed her shoulder, not in tenderness, but in ownership. In his silence, she heard the voice of the age itself. A wife is property, her body a duty, her silence an expectation. When his hand tightened, she flinched. And in that flinch, his cruelty bloomed. He saw it, relished it, and pressed further. For Edward, this was not intimacy. It was conquest. He had acquired her through contract, and now he claimed what the law and society told him was his by right. There was no refuge for her, no law to call upon, no voice that would be believed over his. The doctrine of the age was clear. A husband could not violate a wife, for she had no right to refuse. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of restraint and humiliation. Edward's voice was low, commanding, his every gesture calculated to remind her of her helplessness. He spoke of her as though she were not present, but merely an object, a thing to be compared, examined and subdued. Words like exotic and different dripped with derision, turning her very skin into a weapon against her dignity. The very features that made her who she was became the tools of her degradation in his eyes. Each candle that guttered low seemed to echo her disintegration. Amara's body grew cold, though the fire burned in the hearth, her spirit withdrawing deep within, as though to survive she must detach from herself. This was not simply cruelty, it was annihilation. He sought not only to possess her flesh, but to break her will, to erase the strength that had carried her through the parlour whispers and the condescending stares. At one moment, as Edward stood back to watch her trembling form, he laughed, not with joy, but with triumph. It was the sound of a man who believed he had fulfilled his right, who believed the law and the world stood behind him. That laughter echoed through the chamber like a judgment, like the gavel of a court declaring her condemned. Amara felt something inside her fracture. She could not cry aloud, for to cry was to invite mockery. She could not flee, for the walls of the house were her prison. All she could do was retreat into silence, into the deepest part of herself where his voice could not follow. There, in the hidden chambers of her mind, she clung to memory. Her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, the warmth of Caribbean sun upon her skin, the sound of ocean waves against the shore. She clung to these as lifelines, even as Edward sought to strip her of everything. When the night finally broke into dawn, she lay still, the room around her unchanged, yet her world destroyed. The morning light revealed no bruises the eye could see, yet her body carried wounds invisible but indelible. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The Amara who had entered the house in lace and hope was gone. In her place remained a woman who understood, with searing clarity, the inhuman practice her society not only permitted, but sanctified. The climax of her horror was not merely the violation itself, but the realization that it was lawful, normalized, expected. There would be no justice, no redress, no sympathetic ear. If she spoke, she would be dismissed. If she resisted, she would be punished. If she fled, she would be ruined. The bars of her cage were invisible, yet unbreakable. Edward rose from the bed as though nothing had transpired, his movements calm, unhurried. He dressed, adjusted his cufflinks, and prepared for the day ahead. In his world, this was routine, ordinary, unremarkable. In hers, it was devastation. He glanced at her only briefly, a look that carried no affection, no acknowledgement of her suffering, only the certainty of possession. And so, as the door closed behind him, Amara remained, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling into a silence so vast it threatened to swallow her. The weight of the night pressed upon her chest, making each breath a battle. This was the climax, not only of her wedding night, but of the Victorian hypocrisy itself, a society that draped itself in civility while sanctioning the destruction of women's bodies and spirits, especially those deemed lesser by the colour of their skin. The horror was not in the shadows, nor in whispered superstition, nor in the Gothic imagination. The horror was real, legal, and ordinary. It was in the very structure of marriage, in the doctrines of law, in the racial prejudice that turned a sacred union into sanctioned torment. And in that revelation lay the true terror, that what had been done to her would be done again, not only to her, but to countless others, hidden behind lace curtains and gaslit windows, each night repeating the inhuman practices that history has too often chosen to forget. Morning after morning, the days unfolded with mechanical precision. Edward departed for chambers, his carriage wheels rattling down the street, while Amara was left to wander the corridors of the Ashcroft home. The chandeliers glittered above her head, the carpets muffled her footsteps, but these luxuries were not comforts. They were the bars of her cage. Each polished surface reflected a version of herself she did not recognize. Eyes hollow, movements muted, the flame of her spirit dimmed. She learned quickly that society's gaze was as merciless as her husband's entitlement. In drawing rooms, women appraised her with cold curiosity, offering compliments laced with barbed undertones. What unusual features! How exotic the match! Their voices carried both fascination and exclusion, as if she were not a woman among them, but a specimen, a living novelty. Men laughed more openly, speaking of her complexion with the crude assurance of superiority, their remarks cloaked in the language of jest. Edward smiled through it all, his pride swelling, for to him her difference was not a burden, but a spectacle. His possession to display, his conquest to flaunt. Amara endured in silence. To resist was to invite ridicule. To complain was to be dismissed. Victorian law offered her no protection, no recognition of autonomy. She was, in the eyes of the world, a wife, her identity absorbed into her husband's, her will erased by the contract of marriage. And so the days became weeks, the weeks months, each one pressing down upon her like a stone. But within that silence, a different kind of strength began to grow. It was not the strength of defiance that could break chains, for such defiance would destroy her entirely in a world designed to punish it. Instead, it was the strength of endurance, of survival, of holding on to the fragments of herself that Edward could not touch. In the evenings, when left alone, she returned to the piano, her fingers striking keys with quiet determination. The music filled the empty rooms, each note a declaration that she still existed, that she still possessed a self beyond the cage. And though she could not speak openly, she learned to weave resistance into small acts. She embroidered not the docile patterns expected of her, but scenes from her homeland. Palms and seas stitched in careful defiance, reminders of a world Edward could not erase. She carried memories like weapons, unseen but powerful. The rhythm of island drums, the scent of warm breezes, the laughter of her childhood. These became her hidden arsenal, her quiet rebellion against the inhuman practices that sought to break her. Yet even as she clung to these fragments, she knew she was not alone in her suffering. Behind other curtains, in other townhouses, countless women lived parallel lives. Some were white, silenced by gender, enduring marriages that stripped them of voice. But for women of color, the cruelty was doubled, silenced not only as wives, but dismissed as lesser beings in a society that measured worth by skin. Their names have not survived in history books. Their stories remain unwritten, concealed beneath the lace of Victorian respectability. Amara's ordeal became, in truth, a mirror of an age that prided itself on civility while hiding barbarity in its most intimate spaces. The same empire that boasted of progress and enlightenment trafficked in domination and control. It colonized lands abroad while colonizing bodies at home. It spoke of morality while sanctioning marital violation. It celebrated love in literature while erasing love in practice. Years would pass. Amara would bear children, each one a reminder of the night when choice was stolen from her. She would attend dinners, host guests, smile when spoken to, her face a mask of composure. To the world, she would appear the image of Victorian success, a woman elevated, assimilated, secure. But behind the mask was the truth, that she, like so many others, had been sacrificed upon the altar of respectability, her humanity reduced to a footnote in another man's legacy. The resolution of her story, then, is not a rescue. No cavalry arrives, no law intervenes, no sudden justice appears. The resolution is survival itself, the quiet endurance of a woman who carried her pain in silence, who found small ways to remain herself, even as the world demanded her erasure. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, that inhuman practices did not always leave corpses in their wake, but living women whose souls were wounded beyond measure, who endured because endurance was the only choice left. And what of the impact? It lingers, not only in the life of Amara, but in the echoes of history. The laws that bound her were not relics of some distant barbarism. They laid foundations that shaped modern struggles. The prejudices that marked her body as property were not confined to the Victorian parlour. They reverberated through generations, their shadows visible still. Her story is not singular, but emblematic, one thread among thousands woven into the tapestry of racial and gendered injustice. So we return to the question left hanging in the air. What is the true measure of a society? Is it in its glittering chandeliers, its polite manners, its grand literature? Or is it in the silences it imposes, the suffering it hides, the lives it breaks beneath the weight of propriety? The Victorian age may be long past, but the questions it raises are not. For every Amara Josephine whose name is lost to history, how many more endured unseen? How many stories remain buried, whispered only in the walls of houses now long crumbled? And more importantly, when our age is one day judged, will it be remembered for its progress, or for the injustices we chose not to see? The chandeliers have dimmed, the carriages silenced, the gas lamps extinguished. But the echoes of those inhuman practices remain, and it is up to us, the inheritors of history, to decide whether we will continue to silence them, or whether we will, at last, listen.